July 3, 1977, New York City. The most widely circulated newspaper in the United States of America runs a story on its front page. Not about a politician, not about a war, not about a financial crisis, about a black man from Harlem. And on the cover of the New York Times Magazine, he is sitting in a three-piece suit, silk pocket square perfectly folded, one leg crossed over the other, arms spread wide across the back of the chair, dark-tinted glasses, a small, almost imperceptible smile, like a man who knows exactly how much trouble he is in and does not care even slightly. The headline above him reads, "Mr. Untouchable." The Nixon administration had declared a war on drugs 4 years earlier. The DEA existed specifically to destroy men like him. The NYPD had a special task force dedicated solely to his organization. Federal prosecutors had been building cases against him for the better part of a decade. And there he was, on the cover of the New York Times, smiling. Think about that. The photograph became one of the most reproduced images in the history of New York crime. It appeared on walls in Harlem. It appeared in barbershops from 125th Street to Flatbush Avenue. It appeared in law offices where federal prosecutors stared at it and tried to figure out how a man they could not touch was sitting there grinning at the entire country. The photograph became the thing that finally destroyed him, but not in the way you might think. His name was Leroy Nicholas Barnes. The streets called him Nicky, and the story of what he built, what he protected, what he sacrificed, and how the most powerful law enforcement apparatus in American history finally brought him down is the most complicated and the most suppressed story in the history of Harlem. Jay-Z tried to get this story made into a film. Hollywood passed, twice. And when you understand what is actually in this story, the real version, not the sanitized version, you will understand exactly why. This is the story nobody ever told you. Leroy Nicholas Barnes was born on October 15, 1933, in Harlem, New York City. Not Manhattan in the general sense. Not New York City in the abstract. Harlem. Specifically, the blocks north of 116th Street and east of 8th Avenue, in a neighborhood that the rest of New York had essentially written off before he was born. His mother worked as a domestic worker for white families in the better parts of the city. His father was largely absent. They lived in a tenement building in central Harlem, 4 rooms, radiator heat in winter that either worked or didn't, building inspectors who collected envelopes and looked the other way, landlords who raised rent every year and fixed nothing. The halls smelled like cooking grease and mildew. The streets outside in the summer were packed because the apartments were too hot to stay in. In the winter, children wore coats indoors. This is not a metaphor. This is geography. This is what Harlem looked like in the 1940s when Nicky Barnes was growing up inside it. A neighborhood that had once been the cultural capital of Black America, the Harlem Renaissance, the birthplace of everything from Duke Ellington to Langston Hughes, now systematically gutted by redlining, by disinvestment, by the deliberate structural decision of New York City and the state of New York to funnel money and resources into neighborhoods where white families lived and watch black neighborhoods decay on their own. The legitimate economy offered Nicky Barnes almost nothing. The underground economy offered him everything. He began running numbers as a teenager, collecting bets for the policy wheels that had operated in Harlem since the 1920s. He was sharp. He was organized. He had what the older men in the game recognized immediately as something rare. He did not just want to make money. He wanted to understand how money moved, the architecture of it, the system underneath the system. By his early 20s, he had graduated from numbers to heroin. The drug had flooded Harlem in the 1950s with a ferocity that destroyed entire generations. Barnes watched it destroy people. He understood it completely. And in 1965, after serving a stretch at Rikers on a narcotics charge, he came out of prison having made the most important connection of his professional life. He had met Crazy Joe Gallo of the Colombo crime family. And Crazy Joe, who was doing his own time, introduced Nicky Barnes to the idea that would change everything. Not just what to sell, how to sell it. He came out of Rikers at 32 years old with a blueprint. And within 5 years, he had built something that the federal government would later describe in court documents as one of the most sophisticated criminal distribution networks in the history of American law enforcement. Think about what that means. This is what made Nicky Barnes different from every other dealer operating in New York City in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He did not think like a dealer, he thought like a CEO. The problem with heroin distribution in Harlem before Barnes was the same problem that plagued every unorganized market: inconsistency of product, territorial violence that disrupted supply chains, no accountability at any level of the operation, and a complete absence of what any legitimate business would call quality control. Dealers cut the product with whatever was available: quinine, lactose, powdered milk. Customers never knew what they were getting. Violence between competing operations created instability. Men got arrested because they were sloppy. Operations collapsed because there was no structure beneath the man at the top. Barnes solved every single one of these problems. In 1972, he convened a meeting, not a street corner conversation, a meeting, with 7 of the most powerful black drug operators in Harlem and the Bronx. He proposed something that had never been done before in the history of the New York drug trade: a council, a governing board, 7 men, equal partners, pooling resources, sharing a single supply chain, dividing territory by mutual agreement, enforcing discipline through collective decision-making. He called it the council. Think about what that means. 7 independent operators, men with their own crews, their own money, their own reputations, agreeing to operate under a collective structure with shared rules and shared consequences. That is not gangster thinking. That is Fortune 500 board governance applied to the underground economy. The supply chain ran directly to Southeast Asia. Barnes had cultivated relationships with heroin suppliers in the Golden Triangle, the region spanning Burma, Laos, and Thailand that produced the majority of the world's heroin supply at the time. He bypassed the Italian mob entirely. He went to the source. The product that arrived in New York through Barnes's distribution network was consistently between 30 and 40% pure, double and sometimes triple the purity of anything else available on the street. In an unregulated market, quality is the only brand. Barnes understood that before the concept had a name. The organization's weekly payroll, documented by federal investigators, exceeded $25,000. That is 1 week's payroll. For an operation that employed an estimated 600 to 1,000 people across New York City: runners, enforcers, lookouts, drivers, money counters, lawyers on retainer, and bail bondsmen on speed dial. The DEA estimated the organization's annual revenue at somewhere between $50 million and $100 million at peak operation. Adjusted for inflation, that is between $350 million and $700 million in today's dollars. Think about that. The enforcement arm of the council operated with a discipline that law enforcement officials would later describe as almost military in its precision. Men who stole from the operation disappeared. Men who cooperated with police disappeared. But Barnes also enforced something more unusual for the era. He prohibited his soldiers from using the product they sold. This was not a moral position. This was a business decision. Addicts were unreliable. Addicts talked. Addicts made mistakes that got organizations dismantled. Barnes ran a drug empire in which drug use among his employees was a terminable offense. The branding extended to his own appearance. Nicky Barnes drove a $45,000 custom Mercedes-Benz, custom fitted, at a time when a brand new standard Mercedes cost a working family 3 years of wages. He wore chinchilla coats. He wore custom-made suits from tailors on Fifth Avenue. He wore jewelry that people in his neighborhood had never seen outside of a jeweler's window, not to show off, though it did that, but because in the underground economy, your appearance was your advertisement. It was your proof of concept. It told every young man watching from a stoop in central Harlem, this works. What I built works. Criminologists who later studied the Barnes organization would credit him with something no previous black criminal enterprise in New York had achieved: complete insulation of the upper levels of the organization from direct prosecution. Barnes had constructed a distribution network so layered, with so many insulated compartments between the street level and the leadership, that federal investigators spent 9 years trying to build a case against him and kept hitting walls. 9 years. The federal government, with the full resources of the DEA, the FBI, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, spent 9 years unable to touch him. The money came fast, and Nicky Barnes spent it like a man who had spent 30 years watching other people have things and had made a private decision that he would never go without again. Picture the scene. It is a Saturday night in 1975 at a private club on 125th Street in central Harlem. The room holds approximately 200 people, not 200 random people. The 200 people who mattered in Harlem, in the underground economy, in entertainment, in the small number of legitimate businesses that survived in the neighborhood, in the political organizations that were beginning to organize around community power. The women are dressed in full-length mink and silver fox. The men are in custom silk suits, diamond cufflinks catching the light from chandeliers that were not there 6 months ago because Barnes paid to have them installed personally. At a table near the back, a man in a black chinchilla jacket sits with a glass of cognac that costs more than most people in Harlem made in a week. Around the table are 6 other men, the council. They are not talking loudly. They are not performing for the room. They are the room. Every person in that space exists in relationship to what those 7 men represent: order, money, consequence, and in a neighborhood where the legitimate institutions had failed almost entirely, something that functioned like authority. Behind the bar, bottles of Remy Martin VSOP, plates of food coming out of a kitchen that Barnes had stocked personally, from a butcher and a fishmonger and a produce supplier he paid in cash every week. The music is live, a band he hired, $1,500 for the night. There is no cover charge. Everyone in this room is his guest. Outside on 125th Street, temperatures are in the 20s. The storefronts are mostly dark. The legitimate economy in Harlem in 1975 is a ruin. Businesses closed, unemployment running at 30% in some blocks, city services functionally non-existent. The garbage pickup that happened weekly in Midtown Manhattan happened monthly up here, if at all. The schools were deteriorating. The hospitals were overcrowded. The city of New York was in the middle of its fiscal crisis, cutting services across the board, and the services it cut first and deepest were in neighborhoods like this one. Inside that room, none of that was visible. Inside that room, it looked like power. He was $38,000 into his wristwatch alone. His Mercedes outside had a custom interior that the dealership had never attempted before and charged accordingly. He had an apartment on the east side that real estate brokers years later would call one of the finest residential properties in the borough. He had a house in New Jersey. He had women, several simultaneously, each of whom he treated with a specific kind of calculated generosity. And in every profile, every federal document, every interview given by people who knew him in that era, one word comes up over and over: untouchable, not just legally, physically, psychologically. Nicky Barnes in 1975 carried himself like a man who had done the math and concluded that the rules of the universe that applied to other people simply did not apply to him. But here is what Nicky Barnes did not know. President Jimmy Carter had seen the New York Times Magazine cover, personally, and he had picked up the phone. Here is the contradiction at the center of this entire story, and you need to hold it in your mind for everything that comes next. On one side of the ledger, Nicky Barnes funded community programs in Harlem at a time when the city of New York had essentially abandoned the neighborhood. He paid hospital bills for families who could not afford care. He provided funeral expenses for families in his community who had nothing. He organized Christmas toy drives. He provided jobs, not good jobs, not safe jobs, not jobs that led anywhere with a future, but in a neighborhood with 30% unemployment, he was providing income to hundreds of families who had no other source. Men who worked in his organization sent money home, paid rent, bought school clothes for children, kept lights on. Barnes knew this. He leveraged it consciously, and the community responded, with protection, with silence, with loyalty that 9 years of federal investigation could not penetrate. There are women still living in Harlem today who were children in the 1970s and who remember Nicky Barnes buying school supplies for entire classrooms, who remember their mothers talking about him the way they talked about a neighborhood protector, a man who was here when the city was not. On the other side of the ledger, the product that funded all of it was destroying the same neighborhood from the inside out. The heroin that flowed through the council's distribution network went directly into the veins of Harlem, not into the suburbs, not uptown in a metaphorical sense, into the blocks, into the buildings, into the apartments of children who watched their parents deteriorate. The 1970s heroin epidemic in Harlem killed people openly, visibly, on stoops, in hallways, in parks. Families lost fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters. Children were raised by grandparents while parents were either dead or in the grip of a chemical dependency that the organization Barnes led was supplying and sustaining for profit. He was destroying the community with one hand and building it with the other, and the community sustained him for it because nobody else was doing anything at all. One woman who grew up 2 blocks from one of the council's main distribution points gave an interview in 2003 that captured it exactly. He was the best thing and the worst thing that ever happened to us. We knew what he was. We just also knew what he gave us. And you can't eat principles. Barnes himself understood this contradiction. He did not look away from it. In later interviews, he acknowledged it directly. He did not apologize for it. He explained it as a structural problem, a neighborhood that had been economically abandoned, where the underground economy was the only economy that functioned, where the choices available to men like him were constrained by forces far larger than any individual. He was right about the structure. He was also the man profiting from the destruction. Both things were true simultaneously. That is the tension that never resolves. Because the question this story actually asks is not, was Nicky Barnes a bad man? The question is, what kind of country produces a situation where the most organized, most resourceful, most genuinely capable administrator in a major American neighborhood is forced by circumstance to run a heroin distribution network? What does it mean that the most sophisticated business operation in Harlem in the 1970s was illegal? What does it mean that the man who most effectively served his community was doing it with product that was killing them? Those are the questions Hollywood does not know how to answer, and so Hollywood does not make the movie. But here is what Nicky Barnes did not know. While he was sitting on the cover of the New York Times, while the photograph was being reproduced on walls across Harlem, while he was being celebrated and feared and mythologized, President Carter had seen the cover. He was furious. He called the DEA directly, not through staff, personally. And he said words to the effect of, "This man is on the cover of the New York Times laughing at the federal government. I want him arrested. Now." The DEA assembled a task force, not its standard narcotics unit. A special task force, assembled specifically and exclusively for the Barnes investigation, with resources that had never been allocated to a single target in the agency's history at that point. They embedded informants. They wiretapped. They flipped low-level members of the organization. They built a case over 2 years that the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York described as one of the most comprehensive prosecutorial documents ever assembled against a single criminal enterprise. The trial began in 1978. The evidence was overwhelming. Overwhelming. Not because they caught Barnes in the act. They never caught Barnes touching product. Not because a single member of the council had turned state's evidence. None of them had. The evidence was overwhelming because of the photographs, because of the records, because of the financial documentation assembled by investigators who spent 2 years tracing the money through layers of shell companies and cash businesses and investment properties, and because of something Nicky Barnes had done himself at the height of his power when he believed he was untouchable. He had kept records, meticulous records, the organizational charts, the payroll logs, the distribution schedules, the documentation of a man who ran his operation like a Fortune 500 company and left the same paper trail a Fortune 500 company leaves. The symbol of his power, the discipline, the structure, the corporate precision that had made him impossible to prosecute for 9 years became the evidence that destroyed him. Think about that. January 19th, 1978, Federal Court, Southern District of New York. Guilty. The sentence, life without the possibility of parole. He was 44 years old. He stood in the courtroom in a gray suit, custom-made, because even at sentencing, Nicky Barnes was not going to let them see him look like anything other than what he was. His lawyers had argued mitigation. His lawyers had argued structural inequity. His lawyers had pointed at the photograph, the New York Times cover, the same photograph that had triggered the presidential phone call, and argued that their client had been prosecuted not on evidence alone, but on the embarrassment of a government that could not stand to see that image on every newsstand in America. Women who were in that courtroom said later that the room was silent in a way that rooms rarely are, that the silence had weight, that you could feel 3 decades of calculation, of discipline, of accumulated consequence, compressed into the moments before the judge read the sentence out loud. Barnes did not flinch when he heard it. He looked straight ahead. He straightened his jacket. The people who loved him in that room, and there were people who loved him in that room, did not make a sound. The judge was unmoved. Life without parole. Within 18 months of his sentencing, the council had disintegrated. The organization he had built with 9 years of structural discipline collapsed within 2 years of his removal. Not because the demand went away, the demand never went away, but because the thing Barnes had built was built around a singular intelligence, a singular discipline, a singular capacity for organizational management that simply did not exist in the men he had left behind. Without him, the distribution network fractured into competing factions. Violence escalated. The coherence that had made the council both profitable and, in its own way, protective of the neighborhood, that coherence evaporated. The heroin kept coming. The structure that had managed it was gone. Here is the math of Nicky Barnes's life, from a tenement in Harlem to the cover of the New York Times, from running numbers as a teenager to operating a $100 million annual distribution network, from a neighborhood without heat to a chinchilla coat that cost more than most families made in a year. From a child, the legitimate economy offered nothing to the man the federal government assigned its largest single narcotics task force to destroy. From the most untouchable man in New York City to a federal penitentiary cell for the rest of his natural life. From a man who kept records like a CEO to a man destroyed by the records he kept. From a man who fed a community and poisoned it simultaneously, who was loved and feared and mythologized and prosecuted, who built something real in a place where nothing real was supposed to grow. What this story proves is not that crime does not pay. The sentencing data on American criminal justice is available, and it is not actually the deterrent anyone pretends it is. What this story proves is something more specific and more damning, that the same qualities that would have made Nicky Barnes a celebrated Fortune 500 executive in a different America, the organizational intelligence, the supply chain innovation, the leadership of men, the corporate discipline, in the America that actually existed, in Harlem in 1972, those qualities had exactly one application, and the government that created the conditions for that application spent 9 years and millions of dollars prosecuting him for using them. Jay-Z understood this story. He spent years trying to get it made. The production development documents are a matter of record. Hollywood passed. The notes from the executives, the ones that have leaked, say the same thing in different ways. Too complicated. Too morally ambiguous. No clear hero. No clear hero. In a neighborhood the government abandoned. Running an operation the government spent 9 years unable to dismantle. Building something that lasted longer than most legitimate businesses in the same zip code. Employing more people than the city of New York was employing in Harlem through any official program in that decade. Creating the only coherent economic structure that neighborhood had during years when the city was literally cutting the lights off in public housing and leaving the trash uncollected for weeks at a time. No clear hero. That sentence reveals more about Hollywood than it does about Nicky Barnes. The photo is still on walls in Harlem. The suit, the glasses, the small, almost imperceptible smile. The headline, Mr. Untouchable. Hollywood is still too scared to explain why he was smiling.